The end of shifting didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, and it's happening right now. For more than a century, shifting defined what riding was. If you couldn't manage gears, timing, and throttle, you didn't ride. That skill separated riders from operators. Now that line is being erased. Bikes are rolling out where rider involvement is optional. And once that becomes normal, motorcycling changes forever. Stay with me to the end, because once you see where this path leads, you'll understand why riders who learned the hard way are about to lose their place in motorcycling, and why this change doesn't come back once it's accepted. Shifting was the price of admission. For most of motorcycling's history, shifting was not an option layered onto riding. It was the foundation. From the first moment a rider rolled forward, coordination was required. Hands and feet worked together. Timing mattered. Throttle, clutch, and gear selection formed a single continuous task. Riding demanded attention, sequencing, and physical awareness at all speeds. This was not a feature chosen from a menu. It was the baseline requirement that defined participation. The act of shifting separated riding from simple operation. Operating meant pointing and going. Riding meant managing momentum through deliberate control. Each gear change asked the rider to judge engine speed, road conditions, and intent. Too early or too late produced immediate feedback. The machine responded without interpretation. This relationship made shifting inseparable from the act itself. Without it, riding could not proceed. This expectation shaped instruction, habits, and language. Manuals assumed familiarity. Training emphasized repetition. Early mistakes were corrected through experience rather than explanation. Shifting established a clear threshold. Crossing it meant the rider accepted responsibility for coordination and timing. That responsibility was not framed as optional or stylistic. It existed as a matter of fact, defining what riding meant at its most basic level. That baseline would soon begin sorting riders in ways that were never formally planned. The skill was the filter. Because shifting was mandatory, progression happened naturally. Riders improved by repeating the same sequence until it became reliable. Smoothness came before speed. Accuracy preceded confidence. Each ride reinforced timing and control through consistent practice. There was no shortcut around the process. Mastery emerged from accumulation rather than instruction. This requirement functioned as a filter without intention. Some adapted quickly, others required more time. A few stepped away. No judgment accompanied the outcome. The machine did not accommodate hesitation or force advancement. It responded predictably to input, and nothing more. This created a shared framework of difficulty. Every rider encountered the same learning surface and moved across it at their own pace. As a result, riding culture formed around common effort. Conversations assumed familiarity with missed shifts, stalled starts, and uneven transitions. These experiences were not celebrated or criticized. They simply existed as part of the process. Repetition produced consistency. Consistency produced competence. Over time, this shared difficulty established an unspoken understanding among riders. Shifting did not elevate anyone. It merely confirmed readiness. Over time, outside pressures began asking whether that filter needed to remain unchanged. If this breakdown is challenging what you were taught, hit like so this reaches more riders, subscribe for honest motorcycling conversations, and share your take below. When convenience entered the conversation, as participation expanded, convenience entered discussion as a practical concern. The question was not philosophical, it was logistical. How could access broaden without eliminating the foundation? Convenience addressed usability, reach, and comfort. It promised reduced barriers while preserving function. This framing positioned accessibility as an adjustment rather than a replacement. Early accommodations focused on easing entry points. Controls became lighter, engagement smoother, instructions clearer. These changes did not remove requirements. They refined them. The expectation remained intact. Shifting still demanded coordination and timing. Convenience existed alongside difficulty, not in opposition to it. This balance introduced a quiet tension. Each improvement raised questions about how much simplification was acceptable before the baseline shifted. Convenience solved immediate problems, but carried implications beyond the moment. The conversation remained neutral, focused on practicality rather than consequence. No losses were named, no outcomes predicted. The issue lingered unresolved, waiting for a moment when adjustment would become alteration. That moment arrived when refinement crossed into redefinition. If you're wondering about the gear and accessories I'm riding with while testing these changes, they're listed in the description. Now let's keep going. When the requirement became optional, the pivot did not announce itself. Expectations changed gradually, almost invisibly. At first, optionality appeared as choice rather than removal. Shifting was no longer assumed in every context. The baseline adjusted quietly. What had once been required became selectable. This shift altered definition without confrontation. Riding could now proceed without engaging the full sequence that once defined it. Coordination remained available, but was no longer mandatory. Timing still existed, but was no longer enforced. The foundation loosened. No accusations followed. No figures were singled out. The change occurred through normalization rather than declaration. Instruction adapted. Assumptions shifted. The line between riding and operating blurred not through conflict, but through acceptance. Once expectation changed, requirement followed. The story turns here, not because something was taken, but because something essential stopped being assumed. What the rider no longer controls. Mechanical change is easiest to understand at the interface, where the rider meets the machine. Control once flowed through hands and feet in a continuous loop of input, timing, and feedback. Each action produced an immediate response. Clutch pressure altered engine load. Foot movement selected ratios. Throttle position balanced speed against traction. These actions were discrete, repeatable, and measurable. When shifting is removed from that interface, specific controls disappear from the loop. The left hand no longer meters engagement. The left foot no longer selects progression. Timing no longer depends on synchronized motion between limbs. Input is reduced to fewer variables. Feedback narrows accordingly. The machine still moves, but the sequence that once required coordination is absent. This change is physical rather than theoretical. The rider's body performs fewer tasks. Fewer corrections are required. Fewer mistakes are possible. Response becomes consistent because fewer decisions are made at the interface. What disappears is not motion, but management. Control, once exercised moment by moment, is consolidated elsewhere. The result is an exchange between rider and machine. Input becomes broader, timing becomes generalized. Feedback arrives later in the process. Response is smoother, but less dependent on deliberate coordination. It can be observed through what the body no longer does. The interface narrows, and response patterns stabilize under timing. With those controls removed, progression begins to change. Why skill stops compounding? Skill once increased through accumulation. Each ride added another layer of coordination to an existing base. Input became more precise as timing sharpened. Feedback informed adjustment. Response improved because more variables were managed with fewer errors. Progression remained open-ended as long as the process continued. When systems remove elements of that process, accumulation changes shape. With fewer inputs required, timing becomes less critical. Feedback arrives already filtered. Response stabilizes earlier because there are fewer decisions to refine. Improvement still occurs, but it reaches a plateau sooner. The learning surface flattens. This flattening is mechanical rather than personal. It emerges from how the interface is designed. If fewer actions are required, fewer refinements are possible. Practice reinforces consistency rather than expansion. The system rewards repetition, but limits variation. Skill consolidates instead of compounding. Over time, this creates a ceiling, not a barrier, but a boundary. Input remains important, yet its influence narrows. Timing matters within a smaller range. Feedback confirms correctness rather than guiding exploration. Response becomes reliable but less elastic. The process reaches stability faster, and growth slows accordingly. This outcome follows directly from design choices that prioritize consistency over variability, ensuring predictable response while reducing opportunities for incremental adjustment through repeated input and timing. Refinement across systems built around simplified interfaces and constrained feedback. Once progression stabilizes, further refinement has nowhere to travel. Why bikes begin to respond the same. When mechanical systems reduce required input, response patterns converge. Fewer variables produce fewer outcomes. Timing windows narrow, feedback becomes standardized. The machine reacts within predefined ranges, rather than adapting to varied rider actions. As a result, different machines begin to behave similarly under similar conditions. This sameness does not emerge from appearance or intention. It develops from shared response logic. When input options are limited, the range of possible feedback contracts. Timing differences matter less because the system corrects variation. Response becomes predictable across situations that once demanded adjustment. Mechanical homogenization follows design convergence. Interfaces built to simplify control often rely on similar solutions. These solutions prioritize stability. Stability reduces deviation. Reduced deviation yields uniform response. Over time, machines that once required distinct approaches begin to operate within overlapping behavioral envelopes. The effect is observable without comparison. Acceleration feels consistent. Deceleration follows similar patterns. Transitional moments smooth out. Feedback arrives in expected forms. Response aligns with programmed parameters rather than rider nuance. This is not loss or gain. It is convergence through constrained interaction. This process favors consistency across operating conditions because limited input sets produce limited feedback loops, and timing correction algorithms reinforce similar response outcomes, regardless of subtle differences in rider initiation or sequencing during acceleration and transitional load changes over time. As response converges, differentiation becomes harder to detect. Why this change locks in once normalized. Once expectations adjust, systems are designed around the new baseline. Input assumptions shift first. Timing tolerances follow. Feedback pathways are recalibrated to match revised use. Response is optimized for the updated interface. At that point, returning to earlier requirements becomes unlikely. Normalization alters reference points. What was once optional becomes standard. Training aligns with current expectations. Documentation reflects the prevailing model. The interface is no longer transitional, it is fixed. Design choices reinforce one another, making reversal impractical without broad redesign. This lock, in effect, operates quietly. No announcement is required. Each update assumes the last. Each revision builds upon the adjusted baseline. Input complexity remains reduced because complexity is no longer expected. Timing sensitivity remains narrow because broader ranges are unnecessary. Feedback confirms conformity rather than prompting change. Over time, permanence establishes itself through repetition. Response patterns become familiar. Familiarity reduces demand for alternatives. Engineering resources focus on refinement within the new frame. The system stabilizes. Stability discourages deviation. What persists does so because it is now assumed. This process does not require judgment. It follows mechanical logic. Once expectations reset, the path forward narrows. Reintroducing earlier requirements would require redefining the interface, retraining use, and reestablishing feedback loops. Normalization completes the transition by making the new state appear inevitable. With normalization complete, the change remains by default rather than debate alone. The experienced rider gets designed around Recognition arrives quietly for experienced writers. It appears as a response to changes in expectation rather than a sudden shock. The adjustment is subtle. Familiar reference points are no longer centered. Decisions once informed by long-standing norms now occur elsewhere. The reaction is not anger. It is recognition that the design conversation has moved past a different baseline. This displacement shows up in small moments. Setup assumptions shift. Explanations reference newer defaults. The experienced writer notices pressure applied indirectly through documentation, demonstrations, and demonstrations that assume a different starting point. The response is measured. There is no demand to be included. There is awareness that inclusion is no longer presumed. Being designed around means the reference case has changed. The adjustment is not about ability or relevance. It is about which use case guides decisions. When guidance no longer points toward long-established habits, the reaction becomes internal. Recognition replaces confrontation. The experienced writer reads the signal and recalibrates expectations without announcing it. This response is shared but quiet. Conversations acknowledge the shift without dramatizing it. The pressure is ambient rather than targeted. Recognition settles in as a practical understanding that the center has moved. No protest follows. The experienced writer simply notes the change and continues accordingly. That quiet recognition sets the stage for effects that appear not in words, but in transactions across markets and daily choices quietly. The used market responds quietly. Market behavior reflects response before commentary appears. In the used segment, adjustment occurs through listings, pricing, and turnover. Pressure is visible in how quickly units move and where attention concentrates. Demand shifts without announcement. Buyers compare availability and act within established budgets. Reaction shows up as pattern rather than statement. Value signals emerge through time on market. Listings linger or clear, depending on configuration and familiarity. Adjustments happen incrementally. Sellers revise numbers, buyers wait. The response is procedural. It follows observed outcomes rather than forecasts. Pressure accumulates through repetition of similar results across regions. Buying patterns provide clearer evidence than opinions. Transactions favor known quantities. Inventory that aligns with prevailing expectations moves steadily. Items that diverge require accommodation through price or timing. Adjustment is expressed through negotiation rather than debate. Reaction remains consistent across weeks. This behavior does not require interpretation beyond observation. Demand follows confidence. Confidence follows predictability. Response consolidates around options that minimize uncertainty. Pressure redirects capital quietly, without headlines or commentary. The used market records the change by doing what it always does, matching buyers and sellers under revised assumptions. Those revised assumptions then surface elsewhere, beyond listings, as other segments take notice. Financing terms adjust, dealer sourcing shifts, and inventory rotation reflects the same response over time without altering underlying mechanics or transaction processes already visible across multiple regions nationwide today, during current selling cycles only there. For coverage on where motorcycling is headed, subscribe now. This channel exists to question trends, challenge assumptions, and protect rider involvement before decisions become permanent. Staying informed is the only way riders keep control in a future without asking them. Performance brands lose their anchor. Performance positioning relies on alignment between public image and delivered product. When that alignment loosens, contradiction appears. Racing narratives emphasize precision, speed, and control. Consumer offerings, however, increasingly prioritize consistency and accessibility. The response between image and reality grows uneven. This contradiction is structural. Marketing language references extremes, while design decisions emphasize stability. Timing windows narrow, feedback paths simplify. Response favors predictability over variability. The anchor that once tied competition to consumer experience weakens as assumptions diverge. The result is not failure but misalignment across expectations and execution. Performance signaling remains visible while mechanical emphasis quietly shifts elsewhere. Documentation, demonstrations, and specifications reflect this transition without ever announcing it directly. The brand message stays forward-facing, confident, and consistent. Meanwhile, the delivered experience trends inward toward uniform response, prioritizing predictability over variation. This gap widens gradually, measured not in statements, but in use, as alignment between promise and reality loosens over successive product cycles and market behavior. Over time, the distance between claim and experience becomes measurable. Comparisons arise without being prompted. Alignment matters because it sets expectation. When expectation no longer matches delivery, the anchor drifts. This condition persists without blame. It reflects a system adjusting priorities under internal constraints. As alignment loosens, the contradiction becomes visible to adjacent observers, prompting reevaluation across the category. Metrics increasingly track consistency measures, and development targets reinforce those measures across successive revisions. This trend standardizes response profiles without explicit reference to competition outcomes. The anchor effect fades as emphasis redistributes within the same mechanical framework. Documentation and validation processes confirm the shift over time across product cycles, and update schedules industry-wide alignment. Resistance without protests. Resistance does not always announce itself. In this case, response appears through adjustment rather than protest. Buying decisions carry meaning without statements. Silence functions as signal. Pressure expresses itself through absence as much as presence. Patterns form where options are available but not selected. Inventory remains. Alternatives receive attention. Reaction unfolds through selection rather than commentary. Adjustment communicates preference indirectly. No explanation is required for the message to register. This form of resistance operates within normal behavior and ordinary routines. There are no banners, speeches, or organized campaigns attached to it. Transactions continue without disruption or announcement. Response is embedded in routine choice rather than statement or protest. Pressure accumulates slowly as repeated outcomes reinforce the same direction over time. The signal strengthens as consistency persists across markets, purchases, and absences, becoming visible only through patterns that repeat quietly and without confrontation. Because this resistance is passive, it avoids confrontation. It does not assign fault or demand reversal. It simply redirects participation. Over time, systems adapt to where engagement remains. Silence informs design decisions as clearly as feedback. Absence registers as data. This mode of response remains durable. It relies on individual decisions aggregated across time. Adjustment continues quietly. Pressure persists without escalation. The system records the signal through participation levels rather than statements. Resistance completes its work by remaining ordinary. That ordinariness carries the story forward into broader consequences beyond individual choices. Those consequences emerge gradually as patterns repeat across categories and planning horizons without requiring interpretation or amplification from observers. The record accumulates through normal participation and stabilizes expectations over successive cycles without formal acknowledgement elsewhere. Other manufacturers are watching. Manufacturers across the industry observe shifts before they comment on them. Planning cycles rely on trajectory rather than reaction. Product teams study adoption rates, training materials, warranty data, and service outcomes to understand direction. None of this requires judgment. Observation precedes decision. Imitation risk emerges when one approach demonstrates stability. If a design choice reduces variability, it attracts attention from peers facing similar constraints. Outcomes become benchmarks. Documentation circulates. Internal reviews compare notes. Direction begins to align without coordination. This process follows established patterns. Once a solution proves repeatable, it enters shared reference. The legacy of earlier distinctions fades as convergence accelerates, not because anyone demands it, but because alignment simplifies development paths. Similar trajectories reduce uncertainty. Manufacturers watching from the outside do not rush. They wait for confirmation through multiple cycles. Outcomes are measured in reduced support costs, consistent customer feedback, and predictable service intervals. When those signals persist, imitation becomes rational. No announcement marks this stage. It arrives through specification changes, supplier adjustments, and revised testing protocols. Direction shifts incrementally. Each step appears isolated, yet the cumulative effect is visible. The industry moves together by observing what holds steady. Over time, this shared watching quietly determines the trajectory competitors follow, shaping outcome expectations and narrowing direction long before public strategies are ever discussed internally across the sector. That collective observation sets conditions for consequences that extend beyond product planning. What gets lost? Between generations, cultural transmission depends on continuity rather than instruction alone. Knowledge moves through proximity, observation, and shared difficulty. Mentorship forms when experience is demonstrated and repeated, not when it is summarized. Teaching moments emerge naturally inside that process. Shared difficulty establishes common reference. Tasks that require effort create space for guidance. The learner watches, attempts, fails, and adjusts. The mentor intervenes sparingly. This rhythm passes understanding without formal structure. When expectations change, that transmission weakens. If difficulty is reduced, opportunities for demonstration narrow. Teaching moments occur less frequently. The pathway between generations becomes thinner, relying more on explanation than example. Mentorship then shifts from doing to telling. The exchange becomes descriptive rather than experiential. Shared difficulty once synchronized understanding across ages. Without it, continuity depends on memory rather than practice. This loss does not register immediately. Cultural legacy erodes gradually as fewer situations demand guidance or shared effort. Direction drifts as familiar reference points fade from daily practice. Outcome becomes uneven because transmission lacks reinforcement through repetition. What remains is history without rehearsal. Stories persist, but application diminishes over time. The legacy shifts toward archival memory instead of active use. Direction continues forward regardless. Yet, the link between generations weakens, thinning quietly until continuity depends on recollection rather than lived instruction. This change unfolds slowly, unnoticed, and rarely questioned externally. Over decades, this process reshapes cultural memory, altering how lessons travel and determining which practices endure as living knowledge rather than distant reference points across communities without ceremony continuity or reinforcement in daily contexts. Over time alone here, now broadly shared. That weakening frames choices that follow. The choice without instructions. Long-term consequence presents choice without instruction. The trajectory offers paths, but no guidance. Outcome depends on selection rather than persuasion. Direction remains open. One path is adaptation. Systems adjust to prevailing expectations. Participation continues within revised norms. Adjustment prioritizes ease and consistency. This option accepts the new baseline and proceeds accordingly. Another path is preservation. Practices are maintained where possible. Selection favors continuity. Adjustment occurs through sourcing, maintenance, and timing of acquisition. Outcome emphasizes retention within available structures. A third path is exit. Participation narrows or ends. Adjustment shifts elsewhere. This choice does not require explanation. It reflects alignment between expectation and direction. These paths exist simultaneously. No hierarchy assigns value. Selection occurs individually and quietly. Pressure arises from circumstances rather than argument. The trajectory does not compel. Over time, distribution among these paths shapes the aggregate outcome. Direction reflects cumulative decisions made quietly. Legacy forms through repetition rather than decree or mandate. No instruction accompanies this process at any stage. The absence of guidance becomes instructive on its own. Choice persists because systems no longer define preference or priority. Direction follows participation alone, accumulating meaning through repeated selection across years, markets, and individual decisions without centralized control. This pattern remains stable as conditions evolve and contexts alter. This framework remains stable because it avoids prescription, allowing trajectory to emerge from accumulated adjustments rather than imposed direction over extended periods without centralized mandates. Formal endorsement or evaluative ranking across institutions' markets, or planning bodies operating concurrently through successive cycles, and reviews widely documented internally only today, broadly still overall. That open choice carries forward into resolution. The quiet truth. The opening claim returns without amplification. What appeared gradual now reads as intentional through accumulated outcomes. Direction has shifted not through event, but through acceptance. Legacy follows path rather than proclamation. Nothing new is introduced here. The trajectory has already been traced. Observation replaced debate. Adjustment replaced announcement. Outcome settled through repetition. Shifting did not vanish through prohibition or failure. It receded as expectations changed. Requirements softened. Baseline moved. The process unfolded without confrontation. Design favors what is assumed. Once assumption changes, systems follow. Direction persists because reversal demands redefining. Expectation, that work rarely occurs. This reckoning does not instruct or persuade. It simply aligns observation with outcome across the entire arc. The direction taken reflects cumulative acceptance rather than single decision. Legacy is shaped by what remains assumed day after day. Trajectory becomes visible only in hindsight, when comparison reveals distance traveled. By then, the change feels natural. That naturalization is the final condition. It confirms permanence without declaration and completes the transition described from the beginning without raising volume or assigning blame. This awareness stands alone, marking the end of debate and the start of quiet understanding that persists forward unchanged across time and context, broadly, now settled firmly in place today, here alone. Awareness remains the only response that still matters. Recognition closes the loop without noise or reaction. Legacy forms quietly as expectations settle and the baseline holds. Nothing ended suddenly, and nothing failed outright. Change arrived through acceptance, repetition, and silence. What once defined writing was not removed by force or accident. It faded as assumptions shifted and design followed. Shifting did not vanish overnight. It is disappearing deliberately, step by design. This outcome frames the future direction ahead. If you've been writing long enough to remember when shifting was non-negotiable, you already understand what's being lost here. This isn't about hating change. It's about recognizing when control and involvement start getting designed out. I want to hear your take. Do you see this as progress or the beginning of the end of real writing? Drop your experience in the comments. Model, miles, and years written. If this mattered to you, hit like so more writers see it. And subscribe for honest, writer-first conversations that don't come from a boardroom.